Hello, everyone. I'm Dwana Butler. I'm the program coordinator at NIWIF, and so welcome to this panel that I'm really excited myself to hear and learn from. For anyone who's not familiar with NIWIF, we're a membership organization of about 2,000 members of women and men in film, television, and digital media, and we have 4 areas that we focus on. We have panel discussions, educational opportunities for everyone to learn, to network, and build relationships. We celebrate women's achievements. We preserve women's films, and we advocate for equity in the business. With that said, we're actually part of 40 chapters worldwide of women in film chapters. We have a wonderful lineup here. I'm going to hand it off to Savanna Washington, who is one of our producers here for the evening, along with Anna Breton, Carol Cassidy, and Marcia Rock. So with that said, I hand it off to you, Savanna.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all the producers who worked on the panel, all of us that worked together. So thank you all so much. And thank you to our panelists tonight. I'd like to introduce Carol Cassidy, Claire Ward, Kirsten Johnson, and Beth Levison. Thank you for coming. And so how the program is going to work tonight is each person is going to do a presentation, and Carol's going to start with a very interesting presentation, and then we'll show clips, and as each person shows a clip, they'll talk about it, and then we'll have a questions, and then we'll open it up to you guys.
Basically, what I'd like you to notice if you pass this around and try it, I'd like you to notice the negative space, where you're not covered. Because there's like a lot, right?
Yeah.
You're really, exactly, right? And all under here, and so there are a lot of, now you do have a flak helmet. Would you mind? No. Okay, so you can put this on. That's kind of heavy too. So, your brain is sort of covered here, but again, the negative space, I think, is what you notice right away, and where your vulnerability is. Fortunately, your vulnerability is a key tool in doing this kind of field production. You want to bring your humanity to the work, and one of those things is your physicality, your physical vulnerability. And I think when you feel this, you can always keep in mind that the people you're working with on the ground have nothing. So if you're in a place where people are shooting each other, and I work with a lot of women and children who are not combatants. They're people whose lives are kind of in upheaval because of war. They don't have any protection at all. And eventually you turn around and get on an airplane and go home, right? So, but I think you can, when you think about other people's experience, it helps you to really bring your full humanity to the work. And that's your empathy and your feeling, your fellow feeling for other people, your compassion, your patience with people. And I think that makes for better work. It makes certainly for a better field experience, but I think ultimately that kind of humanity shows up on the screen. And that's one of the things that I'm after. That's one of the reasons why I go to difficult places. So I thought maybe you could send this on. Yeah.
Is this designed for a man?
I always thought it was for a man. I mean, these basically, this was given to me in Kuwait for Iraq when I was working with CNN, and they were, it seemed like there were either like men or like babies. There wasn't really anything in between.
I had one specially fitted for me, and I gave my measurements, and I think it cost the production $700, and I never wore it when I needed it, sadly.
And I think that's a common experience.
Yeah.
Never wear it when you need it.
And why is that?
You just can never predict when bullets are going to fly.
And
sometimes you can. Sometimes
it's a big fat pain in the neck too. That was my experience. I've never been, knock wood. I've never been shot at. The worst I ever had was like kids throwing rocks. That's the only thing. But I do find that those things are an encumbrance. So you find yourself. It's like anything else. The first day, everybody's all bundled up, and then you start to get used to it. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes we would be working out of like bulletproof cars. So you kind of go, I think it's like anything else. You get used to things very easily, very easily.
How many pounds is the helmet? Because that was pretty heavy too.
Passing that around.
It felt like about 5 pounds too. Like it felt, yeah.
But do the men have as much negative space, or?
I know men who've been shot wearing
those.
Those.
Have arms.
Yeah, no, and I've known men who've been shot in what they
Same.
called the French fries. Big heavyset guy was shot, right about here, wearing one of those. And I know several people who've been shot wearing those helmets. Two who just got a headache, and one woman an amazing, wonderful camera woman who was shot in her mouth. So she was not protected by that. And this is another sort of relic from the Kuwait-Iraq thing. This is a chemical weapons gas mask. It's part of a whole suit. I didn't bring the whole thing. It's got like a whole big plastic like moon suit, with big gloves and the boots and everything. But you can pass that around and try that if you like.
Would you wear that for Ebola protection?
No. That was for like chemical weapons. And I think Ebola is a very different thing because of the size of the particles. I mean, I'm imagining that. I don't know. I haven't worked in Ebola story land. The thing is, though, a lot of my friends and my colleagues, the people who were hurt or injured and sort of sidelined by bad things that happened, they weren't the big dramatic things. They were small things, particularly mosquitoes. So we have like these mosquito nets. And again, a lot of people that you're working with on the ground don't have these. And people die from malaria. A lot of people die. But this is something you would, I usually soak this in like a military grade insecticide. And then there's a ring from the top and you kind of hang it if you have a bed or some place on the floor where you're sleeping. Well, I can pass that around with you. I could leave this. Same thing with like all kinds of things that if you find yourself in a bed space that's not at all what you think of like at home. So this is what my husband calls the full body condom. And this is like a really nice cozy thing to just kind of wrap yourself up in and not feel like you're concerned at all about like bed bugs or whatever, all those like creepy crawly things. I have some medical kits. I want to pass these around. If you look, it's similar to me to the vest. What you get is a sense of things that could happen, things that have happened to other people. This one has a lot of syringes in it. You wouldn't necessarily think, but something that happens is that people get injured in car accidents. It's kind of common actually. So if you needed a shot of morphine. In a lot of places, you'd be really happy to have your own syringes. And the medical advisors, the people that you talk to about traveling in difficult places, it's one of the first things they'll tell you. So that, and then this, you'll see that this is like a medical field kit, and it has all kinds of thoughtful little items for people that are sort of producing while human, because the whole key is to keep yourself well and strong and out of injury, out of illness, so that you can work. Because if you fly halfway around the world and then you're crippled with some illness or some injury, you're really not serving anyone at all. So part of this is about protecting yourself. And here's another medical kit that's got some. When you see the details, your imagination, I think, starts to, it depends on how much of a worrywart you are, but I think the imagination comes alive with the possibilities. And then this, I wanted to bring my burqa. I know this, for a lot of people, this is a political object or, that kind of thing, but for me, this is a cloak of invisibility. And in certain places, it's a beautiful thing to be able to just use this on the streets. Try this on. You want to try it? Try this on. I'll show you how to do it. It's more of you might want to take your glasses off. Okay. It's more of a coat than a dress. So this is something you would have over your clothing. And I'm actually going to spin that around because the eyes are here. I'm sorry, did I pull your hair?
No, you're fine.
Yeah, there you go. The eyes are there. So can you see? Yeah, a little bit. That's the idea. So you're tall, so you could probably walk a few steps. But be careful. But you can feel you're sort of confined in that, and you lose your peripheral vision. But nobody can see you. You're invisible. You blend into any kind of crowd on the street, or so it's just sometimes a nice way to diminish the kind of attention that you might ordinarily attract as women shooting cameras in places where women don't often shoot cameras or work as camera crews. I often, in fact, almost always, if I can help it, I work with women in my crews. You want to try with camera women? Because that was one other thing I did want to mention, is that often being a woman is an advantage in this kind of situation. We've had access to women's homes, closed off spaces, particularly in Islamic countries where there's some gender segregation. As a woman, you can have access to stories that are just absolutely not available to men. So if you work with women in your crew especially, you can enter these spaces, and like I said, that's like a coat, not a dress. So people walk into the home space and throw that off, right? So that, and then you have access to women's stories. And oftentimes these are people that have not been heard in a sort of mainstream media context. So there are advantages to being a woman in difficult places.
How effective is it when you're lugging around camera gear, though? Don't you kind of give yourself away?
Well, it depends, because, you know, we have, of course, this kind of schlep bag kind of stuff, and you can always put stuff away, and you do the best that you can. And it's also, it's not always necessary, but I think it's one of those tools that if you have it with you, you can use it in use your own judgment kind of a way, and often it can be useful. It's just an option.
So what were some of the things that have happened to you that have been unexpected, that you thought, okay, wow?
Well, I would say all the time unexpected things happen, but I would tell you that the thing that is most unexpected for me, and I always, always, always love being surprised by people's joy and humanity and sense of humor. Sometimes the people who the most vulnerable people in the world, people who've suffered incredible losses, and people who have lost limbs and family members and any little property they were able to put together. People are funny, and they're sharing, they're generous, they're always talking about who they can help. I want to scrape this little flower business together so that I can help adopt the kids who were orphaned in the war. You know, you can't believe the generosity of people, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So,
Thank you. So Claire's has worked in Ferguson, which has been very interesting.
I mean, I'm sure you guys have all seen a lot of the footage from the Ferguson riots, either from our coverage or elsewhere, so I don't know how much more we want to see, but yeah, this is sort of an example of the kind of stuff we were seeing a lot of. I don't know if everyone wants to sit back down and get cozy.
Yeah, we won't leave you here by yourself.
So just to contextualize all this, Vice News went in several times since August and did different kinds of coverage of what was happening there. So we started with just kind of crashing in the day after the shooting, and with the plan of doing live coverage in the evenings, because there was that first night where there were major confrontations, and it was clear to everyone that the police response was really heavy-handed, and so it was important to have witnesses there on the streets. And we had this live stream technology that would allow us to kind of broadcast everything we were seeing out on the internet for everyone else to see at the same time. But I think, did I just, I'm still here. But the longer we stayed, because it kept happening night after night, we realized, okay, you know, we understand that there are serious police community issues here, and that is made obvious in these nightly confrontations, but there's a larger picture that we need to cover. So we started doing these dispatches, and you see a little example of it in the first clip I played, where we're talking to kids, we're talking to mothers, we're talking to the police officer from the state patrol who was in charge of the kind of coalition of police forces. We gathered all these other perspectives to kind of get at what was going on. We're still figuring it out. We're still putting together a lot of our footage because, well, I mean, we must have shot, I don't know. I'm afraid to look at the sum total of the footage we shot because we just kept rolling. Just felt like a historical moment, and it did feel like we were there to document it in the most traditional sense, to just open the lens and keep rolling and figure out what it all meant later. So that helps because we're a relatively new news organization and not terribly experienced journalists. I'm 2 years out of grad school here. The correspondent you see there, well, you saw two. They're also relatively young, so we're not, terrifically experienced, or we don't have a huge depth of knowledge in the issues that the people are facing who we're covering. And I think we acknowledge that in our coverage, and we ask really simple, basic questions. And we kind of go out and aim to experience breaking news and unfolding events alongside the people who are being affected. And that's kind of our unique brand of news gathering and reporting. And it has its limitations. Occasionally, you feel like you're in the center of the storm, and it's hard to contextualize it and make it make sense in the way that more experienced reporters do. But I think there's a value in that because it's really unfiltered, and I think young people especially like that raw take on what's going on out there. And in sort of an ecosystem of news organizations, we fit in as that sort of unfiltered portal to what's happening on the ground. And so that's what I love to do. That's what my boss has been sending me out to do ever since Ferguson, is do these sort of breaking news dispatches where I go in, I befriend people on the ground, I kind of network aggressively because often I don't have a lot of time to prepare. And I start telling stories as they make sense to me. And I work in a way where I try to build a lot of alliances on the ground with people who feel like they're not being well represented in the more traditional media outlets that have come to cover the same story. And that's how we did Ferguson. And we're still working on that story because it's not over. I mean, it's a microcosm for something that's happening in America that is allowing us a very unique insight in this moment in history. So we want to make sure we get it right. So we're taking our time putting out something more definitive that reflects on all of our experience kind of being on the front lines with the people there. So I don't know if you have questions, but that's kind of my
One of the
spiel.
things I think that was so shocking to everyone was that the police completely targeted the press. I mean, like, they walked into the McDonald's and arrested the New York Times guy, or the
Washington
Washington Post guy,
Yeah.
and another Huffington Post guy got picked up, I guess, at some point. So and then Al Jazeera got gassed. I mean, you just saw it on TV. I mean, they just
we all got gas.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit. About this is the first time I think that was so shocking that this is America, democracy, and that literally the police were targeting the press. And like when he was telling you put the camera down, it's like, wow, really?
Yeah, and I did.
And
I
where
kept
are we?
rolling.
Right. So talk a little bit about that, because I think again that was just so insanely
surprising.
Yeah.
Right. So I've had a really charmed life as a white blonde, and so police are normally my friend when I'm going about my day. When I was sent to Ferguson, I was literally given 2 hours notice, and then I was on a plane. And then that night was some of the stuff you saw where there was like live gunfire and all this stuff. So I knew from the previous night that it could get hairy, but in my mind, I was fearing these rioters and these sort of faceless hordes of people wreaking havoc on the streets and being violent towards each other and to the police, because I'd never covered anything like it before. And from the footage I'd seen from the night before, that's sort of what I was expecting based on the way some mainstream media had been reporting it. So when we got out there and hit the ground, we realized, oh no, like these are just everyday people who are frustrated, and there were some elements, just like in any protest, there's the black bloc who's kind of just there to shake things up because they have a fundamental disagreement with authority, and that's I think obscured the Ferguson protester message a lot for mainstream media. But the real threat was the police, absolutely. And I am kind of accustomed to being protected by them and feeling as though our interests are aligned in preserving law and order and you know, and just keeping people safe. But it was the opposite. I felt very threatened. I felt like nobody was really listening. They had put walls up and weren't engaging with us in a meaningful way at all. And that was a real shocker, and I think I played with fire. I'm surprised I didn't get arrested, because I always insert myself in between the protesters and the riot shields, because you get the best footage that way, right? Like, you're right there in their faces, and you're looking both ways, and you can feel the intensity of what it means to the protesters who are willing to go up to that line. I mean, that's, you know, that's our duty, is to convey that emotionally in the footage. Standing way back and filming it doesn't nearly have the same impact. And then seeing the police just putting up this wall and not, like, you see that guy yelling, "Move, move, move," right? I mean, that, when I watch that again and again, and I'm trying to see in his eyes whether there's any humanity there or any understanding of the pain of the people who are just saying, "Hey, we just want justice. We just want a conversation with you," you know, and I don't see it. And I want to do more reporting on police training in the United States and North America. I'm Canadian, so I'm interested in how this plays out in Canada too, because I just feel like there's this fundamental disconnect there, and if it's there so strong, surely it's happening all over the place. So, yeah.
Can I ask you, hi, that's absolutely fascinating. I was at Wall Street for a year, and the place they tell you not to be is between the cops and the protesters, and that's always where I was. What camera did you use?
Oh, I love technical questions.
I have two technical questions.
Okay.
If you like that one.
We're going to get to Q&As too. We want to get to the last two people
Oh,
also.
okay.
So really quickly.
Oh,
and
really?
then
Can I
we'll-
just quickly ask her that?
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely, absolutely.
It's the Canon C300. Canon C300 with, you know, interchangeable lenses. So I was using L series lenses. But when we were live streaming, we were using, I don't even recall, but it's a more traditional small handheld camcorder with sort of a live stream capability, because it's a lot easier for tight situations, and it also works really well in low light. And one problem with the interchangeable lenses in the Canon, while it's really beautiful and it works well in low light, not all of these lenses have image stabilization, so the footage can be very shaky, and it's already going to be shaky because you're C300. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So, yeah, thank you very much. And so let's go on to Kirsten Johnson, and let's see your clip.
Well, you know, I just let me set it up a little bit before I do, because I mean, I think coming off of what you experienced in Ferguson illustrates really well how places that we believe are known to us are in fact completely unknown to us, and sort of depending on who we are, a place is completely new and an experience is completely new. So that can happen domestically, internationally, in your own city. And one of the amazing things that I find about camera work is that very quickly you start to understand more about who you are in the social landscape, like you did. Suddenly you realized she has privilege in relation to the police. The police initially respect her, and they may continue to respect her in an almost, you know, sort of absurdist way where they're not respecting other people. And that becomes a thing, you're like, oh, can I use that to my advantage? But then the other thing that you start to realize is that you're visible in the landscape in the way that everyone else is. And so that people are watching you filming. And where you are, a conflict has many sides. And where you are and who you ally yourself with puts you in different situations. So if someone sees you with the police or someone sees you with violent protesters, it can shift the way the rest of the crowd responds to you. So that's one of the really challenging things about being dropped into a situation that's unfamiliar to you, is that you have to think in this 360 kind of way, and you're relying upon your understanding of systems. But your understanding of systems might be completely ill-prepared for the system that you are encountering. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's interesting you talk about, like, it started in Ferguson, people then taking cameras away. Unfortunately, it's been going on a long time. And I remember being in the streets of Seattle, which is my hometown, when the World Trade Organization riots happened. And it was the first time that the US police was using military level gear and throwing tear gas at peaceful protesters. And I was completely, like, I was in Seattle. I couldn't imagine that police would throw tear gas at me. And so that I was slow to respond because it was in such conflict with the way I understood the world. But so I'm going to show you guys a clip from some work I did with Laura Poitras, a film called The Oath. It's actually the trailer for it, and it includes footage both from Yemen and from Guantanamo, both which were challenging places to be, I would say. You know, I think the thing for me that's really interesting about this work is that you're trying to understand the world, and the world keeps changing. And certainly, my world changed post 9/11 in terms of the kind of work that I was involved in. I had been very human rights focused. I loved Brazil. I spent a lot of time in West Africa. And then suddenly, when I look back at the last decade plus of my life, it has been very much determined by how the climate of the planet shifted after 2001. And it's interesting to think about how your world has just been shifted by your experience in Ferguson. And that's sort of what I love about filmmaking, is how much it changes you as a person and changes the way you see the world. And so, you know, this film was the first time that I had worked with Laura Poitras. And what's really interesting for me when I look at this footage is we were sort of trying to do this impossible thing. We were trying to film in places you were not supposed to be able to film. You can't film in Guantanamo. We weren't allowed to film the prison in Guantanamo. We weren't allowed to film the trial. How are you going to film with someone who's connected to Osama bin Laden? How do you do these things? And it started from Laura's desire to address Guantanamo, and she felt like there are innocent people in Guantanamo. I'd like to tell that story. So she went to Yemen on her own with a lawyer who was a lawyer for some of the detainees in Guantanamo. And she went sort of from family to family. And at some point, someone said, oh, well, I know Abu Jandal, Osama bin Laden's former bodyguard. Do you want to meet him? And these are these moments in your life as a camera person or as a director or as a producer where suddenly you're like, I really do. What is that going to mean to me? And so, you know, you take these terrifying leaps of faith retrospectively, right? Where you're in the streets in Ferguson and you're by the cops, but people are throwing bricks at the cops. This is not a scenario you have imagined before. And so this is the kind of thing that you develop instincts about over a period of time. And one of the things, I think that we should all feel really clearly about with risk-taking is risk-taking one doesn't do for the pleasure of it or for the adrenaline of it or for the glory of it. I do think what's interesting is that we have a culture in many ways that has glorified war photographers, the work of risk-taking. As a young woman starting out, I felt like I'm not really real until I've taken some real risks. And then it's hilarious, like I watch you pull out your stuff and I was like, yeah, got malaria, yeah, been shot at, yeah. You know, like I have taken risks, but I never purposely put myself in conflict zones. But the world that we live in now, the edge of conflict zones is no longer clear in any kind of way. You can be in any country, in any place, and risk can come at you if you're filming. You can also go to a place where there is, implicit tension, and you can be in a place where whatever authority controls the space. So in Guantanamo, for example, the U.S. military controlled the space. When we were in Yemen, we had this wonderful journalist from Yemen who was he was a producer, and he was somebody who was taking the temperature on what was possible for us to do. And we were always sort of like at that edge of like, ooh, Can we go further with this? Can we not go further with this? And then, Laura went further than he thought she should a couple of times in terms of the relationship that she developed with Abu Jantal. And those are things that you make decisions for yourself, and yet you're at all times trying to bring in more information, not be ill-informed. Think about who are the people who live here, yes, in terms of the people, the civilians, the children, but who are the journalists who live here? Who are the people like me who live here, who care about human rights? There are always human rights activists in whatever community you're in the United States, all over the world. So how do I find those people and get some credible information from them? Because it turns out they've been doing it a lot longer than you have. They have to live there. They're not just going in and out. And so they understand the complexity of the situation in a way that you don't. So it's sort of having a humility about your capacities when you land in a place. But then on the other hand, you say to yourself, like, this is what I do. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not a human rights activist. I'm a camera person or I'm a filmmaker. And what is the onus on me in this situation? So those are the kind of things that you're factoring in. And then, sometimes you're just stunningly clueless. And it takes your breath away, like how close you come to doing something idiotic or, just being in a place where you almost got hit in the head by a brick, and it's when one of my classic hilarious risk-taking moments was in the Hamptons, and I was shooting a polo match. And I nearly got hit in the head by a polo ball, and it would have killed me. It really would have. And I was like, I'm going to get a great shot behind the goal. Turns out polo goals don't have nets. And the balls are really hard, and they get thwacked by mallets. And I heard it whiz by my head with the force a bullet would have had. And so these are the kind of things where you have to think differently about the world, because the camera does give you this joy of feeling like I'm watching a movie. And, it's like, turns out you're in the movie. So, I will have to do at some point, like, the hilarious risks that I have taken, because I think in general, I'm a pretty relaxed person, and I love newness. I'm very curious, and I do have a sense of humor, so I'm always just like, I'm sort of playing with the world. And then sometimes I find myself in these situations where, like, the world is not playing. And to acknowledge your vulnerability, know that you're a body in space, is really important.
Yeah, I love Pray the Devil Back to Hell. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it had to be like fascinating to watch women taking their country back, and it was really dangerous for them. So can you talk about that?
And that's a case in which I absolutely was not there during the most dangerous time. Most of the terrifying footage in that film was shot by other camera people, and one of the most amazing moments with that film was that there was sort of this rumor that the presidential cameraman had footage that he had squirreled away and saved during the course of this 13-year civil war. And he had survived the death of 2 presidents, and he was still working, and you were like, who is this man? And we made a plan to meet with him to see if we could, license his footage at this amazing hotel called the Mambo Point Hotel, which was just one of those, like, you can't believe you're there. It's just, there's the rebel leader, there's the person who's accused of smuggling diamonds, there's the UN person, there's a couple of prostitutes, like, it's everyone in, like, a room this big, and you're just like, I'm here too. And so we were waiting for this cameraman to come, and waiting, and then I went up to the barman, and I was like, we're waiting for this man to come, and he's like, oh, he's been sitting over there the whole time. And I was like, yes, he has. He was the most invisible man in the room. And so sort of, I was like, I wore my big coat tonight to, like, show you how big I can be, but I can also, like, go complete, like, you cannot see me. Like, I've literally been in a room with small children, and I'm like a tiny room where I'm standing, towering above the table where they're eating, and I heard a 5-year-old say, where did Kirsten go? And so this is the kind of thing that you realize over time, if there's a way that you can be in a space that's unobtrusive, you have a lot more possibility.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Beth Levison. So you want to set up your piece?
I am the producer that's here on the ground, and I'm doing two things primarily, and I've been doing them nonstop for like 2 years, so I'm really tired. But it's responding to shifts, and anticipating shifts, what might happen, what has happened, how do we respond, what do we do, and then really I feel like a really important role of mine is to mitigate risk. I'm not alone in that. You know, as the whole team, we're all trying to anticipate what are the shifts, what are the political shifts, what are the personal shifts, what are the economic shifts, and what might they mean, and then how can we all work together to mitigate risk, and what is the team that we can build that can work together to most effectively mitigate risk to get the best story that we can. So, so I feel like, you know, we're all pieces in that puzzle, sort of working together to make the best film or vice dispatch or news piece that we can. So I'm going to show a clip. It's from the Trials of Spring, and the Trials of Spring, it's a multimedia initiative anchored by a feature-length doc. So the documentary is shot entirely in Egypt, and it is about a woman named Hind, who was a village girl living 2 hours from Cairo, who saw what was happening in Tahrir Square, and she really wanted to get involved. Her family didn't want to, so she started to sneak out to participate, and she would get on a bus and take the 2-hour trip in. And one day, she finds herself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she is beaten and arrested and tortured. And it really becomes her turning point, and she decides to devote herself to ending torture in her country. And what our film is about is really from that moment. And since 2011, she has had that original arrest hanging over her. And we've been following her in her fight to end torture and her political workings and protesting. And on February 5th, she was sentenced to life in jail for her role in the protests. So the other thing that I will say that's been incredibly fascinating from a producer perspective is that now we are facing the question, how do we mitigate risk for our character who's still at large? So she received her verdict. She was in absentia, so she is still at large. And so there are questions, can the film be shown? When? Should the film be shown sooner because it shows such a human rights violation, or do we need to hold back because what happens if the Egyptian government catches wind of it and they want to make an example of her? When I started this project 2 years ago, it was supposed to be a film, a look-back film at the gains women made in the Arab uprisings, and we were going to focus on 3 countries, which was an inane proposition to begin with, but we were going to focus on Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and so we started. There was a scout in 2012, and then there were a series of other scouts in 2013, and one of the early scouts was in Tunisia, and Kirsten shot for us, and shortly thereafter, really in the summer of 2013. Morsi was ousted in Egypt, and the whole region exploded. And we actually had a big shoot planned. We were going to shoot, because we were still sort of hoping to do this story about the gains women made, and we were going to do these interviews with women in a studio space in Egypt, and we were going to fly women in from Libya and Tunisia, and we were going to do this whole thing, and the region, it just exploded. And we really had to reckon with the fact that the original story that we had all come together to tell was a story that might be disintegrating before our eyes. And we had to cancel our shoots. And it was funny, I was on a shoot a couple of weeks ago with the sound guy, with Sean O'Neill. And he's like, do you know I'm the sound guy you canceled days before that we were supposed to go on a 10-week trip in Egypt? And I was like, that was you? I was like, thanks for not charging me a kill fee. Anyway. So all to say, so it was this whole other proposition, and then the world changed, but we were really committed to making the film. And I always describe it was like turning the Titanic, because we had to really reckon with what was the story we were going to tell, and what was the story that we could tell, and what's a story that we could tell well. And that was both like a directorial question and a producing question. And so it was a real lengthy process of us figuring, we ended up going to Egypt and shooting. We'd done some scouting, we'd met Hind, we shot with some other characters. And then it was one of those situations of just really seeing Hind's story unfold and her becoming stronger and stronger as a character, and her being the one perhaps through whose story we could tell the larger trajectory of Egypt. But what started out as being a film where it was going to be interview-based, we were going to shoot in a studio, we were going to send Kirsten over, and a whole crew, really became an altogether different affair. And it became that because also we did go back another time. So then we started working with a local cameraman, and then Ginny, the director, went on her own, and with a field producer, to shoot with our cameraman. But then we realized our crew was too big. We had such a big crew that we weren't getting an intimate story. We were all Americans trying to tell a story about an Egyptian woman. They're very suspect of Americans. So it was this whole process of what's the story, what's the way to get the story, how do we produce that story? And by the end, with this scene that we had here, we had we have an incredible field producer on the ground, this guy named Siam. Did you introduce us to
Yeah,
Siam?
who I met in Syria, who's the best.
He's the best. So that was Siam, basically shooting on his own with a PA and a sound guy, very small, Egyptians shooting their own revolution that is still unfolding. Siam really earned the trust of our character, and also importantly, originally we had really dabbled with, should we have security? Should we hire security? Should we bring on security? And it was, a stripping away of security to get to the story. And those were sort of strategic and storytelling decisions that we made. So, so my role really, throughout the whole film has been, what do we shoot? And it's a collaborative process of me working with the director and being in conversation with Siam, who's on the ground, and being in conversation with our character, but what can we shoot, and is it safe? And what precautions do we need to make? And is the insurance fired up? And do you have your insurance so that you know the numbers to call if you need them? And we had a whole system of when we were shooting about texting me to let me know where you are and are you safe or whatever. We had all different systems of communications. But this. So we ended up just kind of going much smaller, but really from my station, I'm really making sure that it's all happening, and also in a very different way from Kirsten, but kind of as crucial to the production, just thinking 360 as well, about safety, about access, about getting the material we need, about getting the material home. We because we were relying on local crews, we couldn't ship. We didn't have someone to bring the footage home. We weren't sending out a camera person. We also couldn't ship it because we knew that at customs they might go through our package. So any time we had a shoot, it was like anyone who's like, "Are you on my list?"
Yes. I get a lot of emails. Are you flying to Egypt?
Yeah, looking for a traveler. Egypt to New York City. Who do you know? Yeah, just like a traveler, anybody. I've got a shipment coming, on the 30th it was picked up on yesterday, and she's making a stopover in Turkey and then bringing us the material. So, I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, what's so fascinating is that everyone has to manage stress with a completely different focus. Like Beth is constantly being asked to have all the answers to questions there's no way she can answer, that are all changing, and people want, she has to deal with people who have rigid guidelines on the other end, the insurance people or airlines, and she's constantly, change is always happening, and somehow she's calm, and you can check in with her and feel like you're supported. And then, what I'm doing, what you're doing, is somehow trying to channel calm within yourself in the context of the place, right? Because you're surrounded by the stress. But it does no good if you're the one who's manifesting the stress. But there's a great, I mean, that's part of risk management is stress management, basically.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that there was this one time where Ginny did end up going again, and the sound guy's house, he'd had a fire. Like, they were on the way to get this amazing scene that was like the whole reason for the shoot, and then the sound guy, there was a fire at his home, and they had to turn around, and she was completely panicked, and what are we going to do, and what should we shoot instead, and here are the options. And that's a real role that I do play, is I'm not in the fray. You know what I mean? Like, it may be 1 a.m. and I'm really tired, but I'm not in the fray. And it is, okay, well, what would this deliver? What would that deliver? It's okay. It's really good that you're there. Should we get another sound guy? Is that an option? Just to go through the options, because when you guys are in the fray, it's incredibly, stressful. Even when you're not in a conflict zone, it's really stressful when you're directing and shooting.
Yeah, and speaking to that, so do you find, because I found when I'm going somewhere that I'm less stressed there than like about a week before, all of a sudden I get like these cold sweats, and it'll last for about 24 hours, and then they go away. So can you, like, leading up to it, like I shot in North Korea, and my parents still don't know I went to North Korea.
My parents don't know anywhere I go.
Right, yeah, because what I found is that if I tell my parents, they will freak me out.
Yeah, they crank it up. They crank it up. I don't tell them
Yeah, so
anything.
can you speak to that about, like, the kind of cold sweats before, and then you kind of come into yourself and then just leave, because you still go.
Well, that's pre-production, right? I mean, you kind of practice everything that you can in your mind, and then you let it go. And I think the more you do in pre-production, the more solid you feel about winging it when you get there, because somehow all of that preparation builds in your mind, and you're solid. You have a launch pad, and then you can kind of take off from there, because it's not possible to predict. But you do your best, and you talk to other folks who've been there, and other women especially. I talk to other women producers who've been to places where I'm going, and I get great advice from them. And I wonder, I don't know if there are women in the audience who are interested in producing this kind of work, but use us. Talk to people who've been to places, specifically places where you're planning to go, and find out, what are the little ins and outs? What kind of shots do you need before you go? Right? What vaccination? Do you need a yellow fever card? They won't let you in without one? Things like that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you're a filmmaker, because you're not trying to think like an immunization person.
And that's a good point, because I guess it's the preparation that grounds you.
For me, it is.
To go, yeah.
I'm all about pre-production. That's like, I'm really solid at pre-production, and I feel like I said, you can't predict the details, but somehow it informs me. It makes me strong.
Yeah, an interesting thing, I'm going to Istanbul next week to an academic conference, and I happened to tell a friend, and he was like, oh my God, and he freaked me, and he's like, oh my God, I would never, I'm like, it's Istanbul. It's like, are you kidding, really?
So it's like an interesting thing of like knowing who to listen to and how.
Oh, who even to tell, or even to talk to.
That's right.
I wouldn't have thought that he would have freaked out.
Right.
But then when he just like went nuts, I'm like, oh, what? And I was just there last year. I'm like, I was there last year, right? And so it is true. Who you tell and who can handle it, because you don't want to manage their stress.
From a shooting point of view, pre-production's obviously a huge component, but I also have kind of a way of transitioning into a new environment that involves just reading and a kind of meditation through. I did a master class here recently, and I really emphasized to the students how important it is to stay physically fit and mentally fit, to just stay alert, but also just our job is really physical, so just staying aware of your strength, of your limitations, being good to your body, looking after yourself. That's a kind of preparation that can go such a long way, because it's very easy to get stressed out, worn out, overworked, and show up in a place and still be in this funk. So I've taken to I do a lot of nonfiction research, but I'll often try to find a book that has been written locally to a place by a fiction author, just to get a sense of the culture and the sensibility of an environment, or to get into the mindset of, and this kind of happened accidentally, but when I was shooting The Architect with one of the designers of the CIA's enhanced interrogation program, who kind of introduced waterboarding into the CIA's planning and how they were dealing with high-value detainees, I was reading Machiavelli, The Prince, at the same time, and then shooting that interview, I was thinking about Machiavelli. You don't want to be projecting ideas onto your subjects, but it's also good to be, when you're behind the camera, just being a bit of a psychologist and thinking about what this all means, and yeah. So I find reading fiction and also watching local cinema and kind of taking in the culture from a place you're going to that doesn't just pertain to your story, I think is a good way of preparing and dealing with the stress too, because it can take the fear out of the unknown, right, and the culture shock when you're a little bit more prepared that way.
I have one more
Great
question, and
advice.
then we'll open it up to the audience. So speaking of Hen, and for all of you, what happens, we think about the people who are left behind and who have interviewed and who have, like you were saying, you don't know whether to expedite the film or not, or what to, so what about the people who are left behind? How do you kind of help with their safety and to make sure that they're okay when, you go home and they're still there?
Well, sometimes you just go home for the night. Like in Liberia, we did an interview with a woman, and promptly that night she was robbed because, we had been in her house and the neighbors had seen that there were American camera people at her house, so they assumed that we had paid her. So, that kind of, sometimes it's just like, it's immediate, and then, you have to figure out how you help someone cope with the situation that you have put them in. But, this thing of like, yes, we have access as women into spaces where men aren't allowed, but then the question is, what can you do with that footage? I shot over the course of 2 years in Afghanistan with a young woman who had given me her permission to film her, and then once she saw what the film was, she said, there's no way I can be in this film. It's way too dangerous for me. And I think this is the new reality that we're in, where we've got live streaming, where people all over the world have access to footage in ways they never have before. It used to be we could promise people, this isn't coming back to your village. In fact, I know for a fact that in her town, people could watch the footage of her on their cell phones. And, so that kind of context is a really new, challenging ethical territory. This is what you guys are in, where it's like, how do you create a multi-platform website in which people tell their stories, but anyone in Egypt, including the military, can look at someone's face and see it and say, wow, a great clearinghouse for finding human rights activists right here at this website. You become a source for people who are after people. So how do you deal with that? I'm dying to hear. I've been asking this question of them the entire project.
Well, we're still trying to figure it out in some ways, and so actually, if anyone's tweeting or Facebooking, please don't use Hen's name, actually. Yeah. But we're trying to figure it out right now, and it's really new news. First that Hind got this life sentence, then we are having a risk assessment done actually by a human rights activist in Egypt to determine to figure out some of these questions. And to be honest, we still don't know. And at the moment, Hind wants the story out there. So ultimately, it's about her consent, And so the other part of the project is we're doing 6 short films about women's political participation in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. And all of those women have also, we've really told them it's going to live on our website. It will be probably promoted through social media. And it took a really long time to produce those stories because there were a lot of people who felt like it was too risky to be involved. And so the new climate is probably affecting the kind of stories that we can tell. Hopefully it's affecting change, but I think it is creating this. It's an interesting dynamic. The one thing that also did happen to us that was fascinating is like we thought we had this stealth plan to get into Bahrain. So, you can't get journalists into Bahrain, and we're partnering with the New York Times on our shorts, and we told them we're going to Bahrain. They're like, you're going to get into Bahrain? And we said, yeah, we figured it out. And so we had a field producer here in New York that we were going to send over there because we knew we actually couldn't ship the footage out. We needed somebody able to bring it back. But we'd heard about this Bahraini film student at Brown. It's a long story, but you just start knowing you start building your connections. And so this Bahraini film student, we reached out to her. She was going home for spring break. She said she would be willing to bring the camera in for us. Then our field producer could just go in as if she was just a person going to Bahrain. And then she would meet up with this young college student and get the camera, and the college student would be the fixer, and they'd shoot together. And then when the college student was going back to Brown, she was going to bring the camera back, and we would have the footage on our little cards, and we'd have our story. Anyway, it's really interesting because our field producer worked many years ago for Human Rights Watch, and she got to the gate, and they said, she got to Bahrain, and they said, "You're a threat to national security. You can't come in." And she said, "How?" She sort of was playing dumb. How am I a threat? And they're like, "We know that you are a threat to national security." So at the same time that there's this, threat to your character, it's also now it's in some places harder to get the stories because they know they're going to get out.
Yeah. And the other thing that everybody needs to start informing themselves on is your digital security. And it's one of these things where you are traceable in all these kinds of ways, but some of the efforts that you may make, I was involved in the Citizen4 film, and part of what we're advocating is that everyone gets encryption. But I was recently planning to go on a trip to Saudi Arabia to do a workshop for young filmmakers there, and inadvertently I learned if you have encryption on your smartphone, you will be arrested. And it was just like okay. Guess I needed to know that, and so it's this shifting, there's all kinds of shifting sands, and, sort of each different country has got a different set of parameters, and within, talk about within China having so many different parameters, and a local bureaucrat treating you one way, all these different sort of authority levels that you're dealing with. I was just talking with a Pakistani friend who had 11 different intelligence agencies tailing her while she was working on a film that was not a political film. It's a portrait of a barber, but that you have to know the context in which you're operating, and I do think that the digital surveillance technology is going to affect all of our work in ways that we can't understand yet.
It must have felt like a caravan behind her.
Yeah. It's good to know you're being watched.
Can I ask the first question? It's me.
Oh, hi, Marcia. Yes.
This is for all of you, but I'd like to start with Kirsten. What was the most frightening moment, and I hope you'll tell us about working with Laura on the part of the film that never made it, and what did you learn from that experience?
I think, I share this with Laura. I feel a real hesitancy to talk about my own risk and my own fear, because in general, in my experience with this work, other people's risk and fear has been far ahead of my own, and I feel like in some ways talking about one's own experiences is always important, but it's also a way of glamorizing this phenomena and sort of saying, look at me, I almost got killed here, and this is something that you perpetuate these myths in some ways. People want to know, oh, what country did that happen to you in? And oh, you went to Istanbul, and and so I feel like, there's this sort of way in which we create fear about the world. And then we all project and go into the world with fear. And so it's hard for me to talk about certain things. I do feel like some of the things that I have experienced, I feel like I couldn't have done anything differently. It just happened, and we were there, and that's in the order of car accidents, and suddenly violent situations erupt. Like violence, like you can have a festering situation. Like from what we've learned with the Attorney General's report in Ferguson, it's been festering for a long time, right? That's a festering situation, and it went off. You might be in a place where everything is okay 1 minute, and then that protest, it wasn't okay anymore. So that's how violence happens. It just sort of comes at you like a car crash. Yeah, so I mean, it's funny. In some ways, I don't want to create the mythology of me and the things that I have experienced. But
you had mentioned with Laura that our own government was pretty scary when you were working with her.
Well, I mean, I think that we didn't know the territory that we were going into. Once Laura when she made My Country, she was falsely accused of having knowledge of an IED going off in an area where she was filming in Iraq. And that information followed her, and like for many years it would just like pop back onto her Wikipedia page all the time, and it has been refuted. It was still brought up in the New Yorker profile about her. It's constantly being refuted and there's no grounds, but that I think was the initial trigger to her getting on a watch list, and then sort of once you're on a watch list, you don't get off a watch list, or until now, she's off the watch list. And so there was a sense of, okay, she was being detained at airports, and you can read all about the specifics of this. There's a great piece that Glenn Greenwald did about her experience being detained. And then when we went to show The Oath in Abu Dhabi, that was the first time that I was detained. And one of my favorite moments ever was that the border guard said, "So do you find the people to talk to and ask the questions, or do you just hold the camera?" And I was like, I just hold the camera. And all of us who hold the camera are just idiots. We have no idea what we're filming. You know, so it was nice to, I mean, that's one thing that often works in your favor, is having people not think you're capable. And guess what? As women, turns out, surprise ladies, I know none of you know this, a lot of times people assume you don't know what you're doing. Yes. And that can be really useful because...
Yes, very, very
helpful. Yeah, and just, I mean, you don't even have to play dumb. They just assume you're dumb, and then you can continue on.
Assume you're dumb and not a threat.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah, but I mean, there was a long time while we were making the film that eventually became Citizen 4 that we didn't know, we just didn't know to what extent we were being surveilled and what that meant. And, you know, as we learn in all of this, what feels like it's safe territory to be in, it is the right that we have as journalists to be in this territory. Sometimes those rights get revoked in very arbitrary ways. And, you know, sometimes by your own country, sometimes in your own country, sometimes, you know, in places where you know that you have the right to be filming from a sidewalk in a public place, but a policeman is telling you you have to turn that camera off, and you make the decision, am I going to be arrested for this footage? Am I not? You know, so that's the sort of shifting sands of it, I would say.
Microphone? Oh, there, right there.
Hi. So I'm fairly new to filming in other abroad, you know, on Frontline stuff. So it's only been like 2 countries. But I wanted to know, for everyone up there, what would be like your tried and true rule that you would take with you if you want to get really good footage, but you want to also come back home safely, yeah, in one piece?
I like to be small. I like to be invisible. I don't like to draw any attention to myself. The smaller, the more invisible I can be, the more I can convince people that I'm harmless, that I'm stupid. There's nothing, I'm not taking any notes here. I'm not, nothing bad is gonna happen with me around. I'm just a girl, you know, or however that is. I mean, it happens to come up with being female in certain cultural contexts, but I just like to be as small and invisible as I can. I think that serves my work. It shows up on the screen, and it also, I think, helps protect the people around me, because as you say, sometimes neighbors will be conscious of your interaction with folks, and then they'll assume that there's either, you know, you left some money there, or there's some kind of exchange. So just to me, I just think the smaller, the more quiet, the more invisible, that you can make yourself, and whatever that means in the cultural context, I really like that. I think it's a really good strategy for many reasons. And ultimately, I don't ever want to be the story, ever.
I think I'm totally on board with being as small and discreet as possible, but I think my number one is making friends. Make friends. Get to know the people who you're going to be around, who are going to be seeing you around. Introduce yourself constantly. That's what worked in my favor in Ferguson eventually. Everybody knew me at a certain point because I was just going around saying, I'm with Vice News, I'm Canadian, I don't know what's going on. Like I grew up in an all-white neighborhood, like tell me about your experience, like using the, like playing dumb, but being really, just really honoring people's experience and following up. I have a phone full of contacts from Ferguson who are now people I just regularly check in with, like how's it going? What's the mood in the street tonight? People have your back, and I've lived in kind of sketchy neighborhoods before, and I found the same thing is true if you're renting and, like a tough neck of the woods. Just make friends with the people who look the scariest, and they have your back, If they don't feel threatened by you, they may actually turn out to be really useful friends to have when the chips are down or whatever.
And the other thing, protect your footage. I mean, you really have to protect your footage, particularly since we're in a digital age. Like when I was shooting, I had SD cards that I hid within another case. And then on my laptop, because we knew they were going to go through all of our devices, on my laptop, I hid footage under files that were in very strange locations because I knew they weren't going to go through 400 files on my computer. And so it's just one of the things is really protect your footage because you've done all this danger and taken all this risk. And if you don't get the footage out of the country,
But we always did. There's a copy of everything we shot wherever we shot it. So we always left to drive, whether it was in Libya or Syria or Turkey or Egypt. We always left to drive.
that's a
with
great
that
idea.
material.
That's a great idea.
Backed it up.
I mean, I just want to respond that like all of these answers are true. It's like improvisation is your rule, like because. Like she's saying, like I actually sometimes being the person who people, it's like you connect with people, you like be yourself, be transparent, like because in some ways if you're trying to be something you're not, that plays itself out. So, be transparent about who you are, and it's like, sort of trying too hard to make friends with people too early, trying to be too quiet. All these things are like not true to who you are in the world. Like be who you are in the world because that's how you know how to best function. And we all have different styles, right? And over time, your style might shift, but it's sort of like own your presence in the world because sort of each of us have a different impact in our space when we arrive and live with that, live with the implications of that, and enjoy that. Because I think that's sort of thrilling to people and they want to know who you are in a certain way.
1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
That's kind of quick. Hi, I'd love to do a film on you guys. I mean, this has really been a phenomenal experience for me. I'm a combat photographer in the scary streets of New York City. And I have a question I'd like to ask you about what camera you use and what mic you use, because with run and gun, you're just like, rarely are you miking people, right? And also you, what mic was on your camera? May I ask the two of you?
Well, I mean, I've certainly for long form documentary filmmaking, sound is like the most important thing. And so I try to always work with sound people when I can because they do the best sound. And it's very rare that I don't work with a sound person. If I don't, then I try to have equipment that is either completely independent of the camera, like if you're working with a small camera, then you have like a Zoom recorder with a good Sennheiser microphone on it. There's these great, you're in New York City, you have the most extraordinary resources. There's, Hello World is this amazing sound place. Production Junction around the corner from here is a great camera rental place. And what I always sort of advocate is don't just buy gear before you know what you're making. Like, go talk to people at a rental house and rent something for a day, take it out.
Yeah, I always
Right,
do that.
right.
The question was, what do you do?
Well, but I do something
Everything.
different for every project.
me
And
too.
I think that's the important thing for everyone to understand is like there is no magic bullet in this. Like the technology is constantly changing, your relationship to the subject is constantly changing. So what you need is this sort of fluidity and responsiveness to what's out there and what's available. But you really do have wonderful experts in this city who are ready to talk to you about it. So talk to people and get online and read about it.
And actually, that was my one note to you, the young woman who asked, how do you bring back the best footage? It's also, you know, everyone may say, oh, the Nikon, oh, the F7 or whatever it is, it's the camera to have, it's the best camera. Well, for what you're doing, it might not be the best camera. So make sure you're making the right technical and decisions about what camera you're going to shoot with. You may go to a place where it's not that smart to have a camera that looks like a movie camera, but if you went with a DSLR and it looks like a still camera, you might have better success. So making those choices, having the right adapters.
Yeah, and it really is the person who's shooting, you guys. Like, I mean, it makes me ill how my entire career has been on terrible cameras, and everybody gets the great cameras now. Like, I've been shooting 20 years on terrible cameras, but that was the moment in history that I was in, right? And you guys are in an extraordinary moment in history where there's great cameras available, but it's still the person who's shooting. It's not the gear.
Right, second person, two? Yeah. And it looks like those are the last questions we're going to be able to get because we need to get out of here by 8 o'clock, so.
Thank you. Hi, my lifetime experience with camera is always to capture something beautiful, something happy. So I'm really curious to know how do you feel to capture something that is sometimes terrifying, sometimes even traumatic, and how do you relate to the community that are featured in your footage? Do you feel like you're actually a rescuer, a survivor, or just purely an observer? Thank you.
Super interesting question. You want to take that?
You can go first.
I actually don't think I completely understand how I relate to it. I think my desire is to film people with this sort of open gaze, and I'm often trying to see beauty in any context that I'm in, similarly. But I think trauma is a surprise. It's like violence is a surprise. It's much more complex than you realize when you're initially filming it. And I definitely feel absolutely connected to people when I film, and I feel empathetic. And I'm often crying when I'm filming, and I'm trying to get the focus. But you know, I really do feel connected to people, and yet as I look back over time, I'm sort of shocked by how I've compartmentalized a lot of experience. And you know, I think there's really new, interesting research going on now into how all of us deal with trauma and how images impact us and where you hold things in your body and all these things. And it's like, I think we all have a lot to learn about how this work impacts us and what it means to connect to a community. It's like, you know, it's maybe you connect to a person for one afternoon and it's really meaningful to them because they desperately want to be heard and they've never been heard before. That might happen. It also might be that you set up a world of expectations that you don't meet in any way. And a lot of these things you just can't know. And you're doing the best you can, but the best you can may be woefully inadequate. So how do you cope with all of that is, you know, over time you think about it in different ways, I would say.
I work with many traumatized people, many people who have been through a horrific experience. And everything that I've studied about trauma and everything that I've learned indicates that many, many people do find that telling is somehow healing, somehow therapeutic. Not always, and obviously you do, I think, often create expectations in yourself and in other people that you can never meet. But I like to think of my work as service. I feel like I have the illusion, at least, of being useful. I'm not a doctor, and I can't give immunizations to babies, and I'm not, you know, I don't serve in other ways that people do that's much more maybe tangible. But I will listen. And I will try to take your story and present it to a larger audience. And I feel like that's what I can do. And that's what and I'll do it with all my heart.
3, and then with the 4 that we had, the last ones, 3, and then were you 4? Somebody was 4 over here, yeah. Okay, so he's 3. No.
Yeah, go ahead.
So a few of us here are from a Crisis B class that's at NYU, which is a class based on reporting areas of crisis. And since all of you have experienced that, I wanted to direct this a very general, probably heavy question. What do you see as your personal motive and the ultimate goal of your reporting? Like, do you, especially when you have to deal with all this red tape stuff that gets in the way, and it's worth it. You have this this is why I wanted to do this piece to make people understand this, and then is it simply awareness, or like often I'll watch a really impactful documentary and I'll say, wow, that's so powerful. Now what? And so can any of you guys speak to that? All of you.
I'm happy to. I mean, I don't consider myself just a conflict, a filmmaker of well, actually I am a filmmaker of conflict because films are always about conflict, but I'm not just a conflict zone storyteller. But I think all of us up here are filmmakers in some way, and so speaking for myself, I mean, I want to tell an incredible story that changes whoever sees it in some small way. I mean, it can be an emotional response. It can drive that person to want to learn more about a place. It could make someone think twice about their own situation, or make them understand a part of the world. I mean, it's very, it's super basic. Like, it sounds like a Hallmark card almost, but I mean, I'm just in this to have some kind of, to shed some light on the world and who we are, like our shared humanity.
Well, I mean, it's like, you know, I think I go back and forth of like, are we creating change? Are we not creating change? And the only thing that I can know is what I have experienced as a human being. And I am very grateful to the artists and the journalists who've worked so hard to help me understand the world. And so that's the community I want to be a part of. So I think about the strange things that shifted me and made change possible in me, and they come in many different forms. And so that gives me the sort of freedom, I think, to think about all the different ways that we can make work. And you know, that different things are going to get to different people in different ways. And when you think about your own life and what's shifted you or made you just like have hope again or have the desire to do something, like what is that did that to you? And how could you be a part of doing something like that, I think is the thing that I'm always trying to figure out and think about. But I enjoy it. I love this work. Like, I feel like I've had, you know, this insanely thrilling life. And I'm really having a good time. At the same time that I'm like full force in the, you know, like brutal injustice of the world. It's like fucking heartbreaking out, you know, and that's hard to take over time. But it also is like, it's also, you know, just the sort of the courage you encounter or the hilarity that you encounter in the face of that is completely, you know, keeps you energized and wanting to work harder.
And I think sometimes the activism helps your optimism. Because if you're not doing anything about the world, because it just really sucks sometimes, that if you're not doing something about it, that's just depressing. But to be able to be out there being active and doing something about it, it actually, the activism helps your optimism.
Yeah, this is definitely not passive work, that's for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I've been meditating on that question and trying to think of a good answer, because I know what you're getting at. Well, I don't know if you're getting at it, but it's something that comes up with conflict photography and filmmaking is sometimes journalists can be driven by the adrenaline or the excitement or the glamorization, is that a word? Of the job and chasing the bang bang. It's this weird sort of sickness that some of us have. And on the flip side, there are also people who are cursed by compassion and just can't get up in the morning without doing something about how fucked up the world is. And I think I'm maybe more on that side of things. Like, I do wake up to news alerts every day, and I can't really focus my sense of career or future without considering doing something about this, this 500 people just abducted in eastern Nigeria. I was going to be going to Nigeria a couple weeks ago to that area, and just thinking about how my presence may have helped point a light and focus on what's going on up there in the context of the elections and what's happening. And yeah, and I think if you want to do this work, it's not glamorous. It sucks for your personal life. It sucks in your relationship with your family because they're always worried about you. And it's not easy personally. I think it's, you are confronting, like, why am I fascinated by other people's horrific situation? Like, why am I coming in and inserting myself as this outsider who's inconveniencing people, who's making people uncomfortable because they've never seen this camera thing before, or they've never wanted to tell their stories, but they, all that's to say, it's not an easy answer, and I think everyone's got a different one, but for me, I do feel a kind of deep need to go out and bear witness or document history or whatever sort of, like you said, Hallmark card version of a journalist's motivation you want to use. And I think it's possible that, I grew up moving around a lot in a military family, and it's possible that because I don't have a strong sense of home connected to a place, I've looked for home in people everywhere, and so maybe that's my little cheesy version of what drives me personally, is that I'm at home anywhere and nowhere at the same time. But it's complicated, and it's something I think we all confront when we get to our hotel rooms or wherever we rest.
It doesn't stop being complicated. Yeah. It doesn't stop being complicated.
Yeah. Before we take the last question, we will, once we finish tonight, we actually have to have everyone kind of leave because we have to be out of here by 8. But this conversation will continue with drinks at Phoebe's on East 4th and Broadway. So hopefully some of the panelists can come over, and you can meet us over there, and we can have more conversation at Phoebe's.
When you leave, you make a right and cross the street. You'll see it.
Perfect. And so last question.
I am number 4.
We'll have 2.
Okay, we'll have 2. Okay.
Okay, I'll go quick. I'll just plug in really quickly. I work for Story Hunter. We're a platform that brings together publishers and freelancers. One of the questions that we deal with a lot is freelancers who are in dangerous places. We actually offer insurance to people who are commissioned in dangerous places, but I guess the question is, are there countries or areas nowadays that you guys would say no to, that you actually wouldn't go into? Considering there's Anya and Kathy from AP in Afghanistan who were following instructions, were given security advice, and still there was a tragic ending to that story. We're laden with stories like that. But so are there countries and places nowadays where you wouldn't go on assignment?
I think each person has to answer that for themselves personally. Like, I have 2 small children right now, so I make different choices than I made 3 years ago. But I think one thing that everybody has to think about is informing themselves, and you have an obligation, I think, to yourself, your family, your friends, and to the world not to put yourself needlessly at risk. I'm glad you didn't go to Nigeria to cover that story. You're not prepared to do that story yet. You need experience to do these kind of things. Like, you need to learn by doing, but you start to multiply the number of factors. It's like, I don't speak the language. I know nothing about the culture. I know nothing about conflict zones. I don't really know how to use a camera very well. And you have too many things that are out of your control. So it's like, there are plenty of stories that are urgently important for human rights activism that will give you the chance to learn to use a camera. Because you don't want to go risking your life in a place and you come back with footage that's out of focus. Like, that is not the point of this work, right? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, you got to be honest with yourself, and instead of like throwing yourself into a situation where it's like, I got to prove myself now because the market demands it, or my own sense of ego demands it, or my own compulsion to be like, you know, like we're all completely moved by the abduction of these girls, that story. Why isn't someone doing something about it? You feel like I'm the person who needs to do that something. You are putting a lot of people at risk if you are not prepared to handle that situation. And, you know, you can't know everything, but, you know, I think a great example is someone like Laura Poitras, who managed to do what she did and come home with the story of Citizen 4 safely, and Edward Snowden is not in prison. That's like 15 years of being prepared to handle that situation. And it demanded everything she had. And I think she did it by the skin of her teeth. You know, it was like a really close call on a lot of levels. And so this, you know, you have to put time into being prepared to handle the most dangerous situations. And that, I think, is, you know, certainly something that I respect, all of our desires to throw ourselves into situations. But if you're throwing yourself into a situation you're not prepared for, I would say you're doing harm on a certain level.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I didn't go. We had someone there who, I don't know how much, well, it's all eventually coming out on our site, but we haven't published it yet. But we had someone embedded there with military experience and background who needed a camera person. But ultimately, it was my decision not to go, which is interesting, right? Because we did a risk assessment and we prepared for probably 3 months in advance, researching the story and stuff like that. But I just felt, well, yeah, I mean, you just watch the news and you see what's going on, and it seems absolutely ludicrous, you know. And you find other ways of covering the story and paying attention to those areas and monitoring them for times where it's safer to go and it makes more sense and the right combination of crew and intelligence and support on the ground exists to actually, you know, do the story. So,
Last question. This goes back to what Carol said earlier about being invisible and being small and a fly on the wall, essentially, getting the story. The difference I see with Claire's Vice TV is that Claire is on camera. Claire is, did I see you in footage at all?
That wasn't
okay. So
that was just another blonde white girl.
Okay.
They all look alike.
All right, well, then maybe my question is going to be very short. Because the difference I would have said is that, you know, if you were to impose yourself into the story, and I don't know if any of you have ever done that and been on camera in your documentaries, or if you would, if Claire did get on camera and thereby develop herself as sort of a celebrity herself for repeated audiences of Vice, then would that relationship with the camera and with your audience change over time? But since you don't do that, okay, so the reporter who did, does that person work for Vice as well?
Yeah, she does. She's a writer, a staff writer.
Okay. So will her intrusion into the story and will her repeated occurrences create a certain level of celebrity whereby the anonymity and the relationship with the audience and the camera, will that change over time in terms, do you think? I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to get at. Because you're no longer the fly on the wall. Mm-hmm. You are, in people's minds, somebody who has influence.
Yeah, or someone has notoriety. I mean, I've worked with Michael Moore, and it's very difficult for him to make a film now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Laura Poitras is about to find out how difficult it is for her to make a film now. Like, things shift, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to adapt to those things. And I do think that the celebrity culture that we're in is a different reality now, too. But yes, absolutely. But I think also the sort of the myth of we are flies on the wall. I don't think any of us are flies on the wall. We're actually quite present in the storytelling and in the investigative work, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All the decision making. That's why I wouldn't use that phrase, is because every decision that you make all through pre-production and in the field has your little stamp on it. You know, so you change things by observing them, right? So I'm never visible in my story. I don't even use my voice in my story. I don't ever do that, but I don't pretend that I don't make every decision that creates the end product.
Maybe that was the wrong word. The invisible quality, being behind the burqa.
Yeah, I'm talking, I think in that sense, I was talking more about navigating streets even, and cultures and cities, and just being aware of my presence in a place and trying to be small about that, and not being big and loud and, you know, attention drawing. I like to be the opposite of that. But in terms of the actual story, I try to be completely aware that these are my decisions that shape the piece. And I try to be hyper self-conscious about that, because I want to be careful.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. And
Please join us at Phoebe's.
And I'd like to end with, a journalist said once that one of the things he does as a journalist is to introduce us to ourselves or introduce us to one another. And so I just want to thank you all for the introductions that you have made through your characters. So thank you very much. Have a good one.